Too bad Mrs. Not you so
Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see all of you here this evening. Let me go ahead and open us in prayer as we get started tonight. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time as we gather together and study your word. We ask that you would bless us during this time, that your Spirit would be with us, that you would give us understanding, especially as we tackle this difficult book of Revelation. We ask that you would bless us in this effort, as you've promised in this very book, that those who hear and read this book are blessed. We ask, Lord, that you be with us, and we pray all of this in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, as we get started this evening, we're beginning our study through the book of Revelation. I just want to talk a little bit about my own history with this book. Revelation is one of my favorite books. It's actually probably the book I've read more than any other book of the Bible. And part of the reason for that is, when you're younger, sometimes you can struggle a little bit to pay attention during sermons as a kid. And so one of the things that I would do if there was a time when I was just struggling to pay attention is I would read the book of Revelation. And I had no idea what I was reading, but it was interesting and fun and exciting with all the imagery. And so while I did not understand it at all, I enjoyed it. And so I read it a lot when I was a kid. Now as I'm older, I am not going to pretend that I understand everything in the book of Revelation. Revelation is a difficult book, and again, while it's still one of my favorite books in the Bible, we need to approach this study with a posture of humility. And actually, even if you go back to the early church, the entire history of the church has had a uniform testimony that Revelation is really hard. The early church fathers talk about how hard it is. In the medieval times, various theologians talk about how hard it is. Calvin did not write a commentary on Revelation. Calvin's successor, Beza, also did not write a commentary on Revelation. I was reading another Reformed theologian at that time who he wrote a book where he it's not a full commentary, but he's kind of has little explanations going through the entire New Testament. And he says, I wanted to skip Revelation because I do not understand what's going on. And so we just need to recognize this has always been a difficult book that Christians have disagreed on. And so we need to be charitable with each other as we go through this study. I've got my perspective, and just in my years and years of study through this book, I've got my perspective of how to read through different things. But I'm not going to be right on all of them. There may be questions that you have that I'm like, here's my best guess, but I'm not 100% certain. This is kind of where I lean towards. And it's okay if we disagree on some of these things. The important thing is we agree on the fundamentals. Things that we'll see that Revelation teaches are that Christ wins. That's the main theme. Revelation is being written to a persecuted church. Whether you're focusing on just the immediate context or even the church through all ages, one of the lessons for us is that even though we suffer in this time period, even though the world and the devil are opposed to Christ and his church during this time, Christ wins in the end, and he vindicates his church, and that should be an encouragement to us. We have as well, we're taught that Christ will return, that there will be an end to history. There will be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. There will be a final judgment at the end of all things, where the wicked will be condemned to hell and the righteous will enjoy the new heavens and new earth with God for all eternity. Those are all things that we as Christians can agree on, even if we disagree on the specifics of the seven seals or the horsemen or things like that. We can have disagreements about that. These other things are the fundamentals that we do agree on. So as we get started this evening, I want to do a little bit of introduction to this book. We're not going to get too much into the particulars of the text this evening, though we will look at a couple things. But I want to give us some background to the book and deal with some specific issues that we have to address at the outset before we get into the particulars. So just a couple background things. First is who wrote the book. The majority of the church has testified, with a few exceptions, but almost everyone recognizes this was written by the Apostle John. John identifies himself as the author in several places. For example, verse 1, he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. And pretty much everyone recognizes that this is John the Apostle. We've been going through the Gospel of John. So this is that same apostle who wrote the Gospel, who also received this revelation and wrote this book. The book of Revelation has an interesting history in terms of its relationship to the church. In fact, it's one of the earliest, or one of the first books that has just early in the history of the church is quickly recognized as being part of the Scriptures, as a book given by God. Though over time there end up being some debates about the book. And part of the reason there's debates as to should this book be included as part of the Bible or not is because of the difficulty of the material. And as time goes on, you just have more and more debates and various interpretations. And so there's disagreement at different points as to whether or not it should be considered part of the Bible. But overall, the church has generally recognized it and even has very early people attesting that this is part of the Bible and should be considered the Word of God. Probably the biggest issue that we need to address, though, in terms of just preparing to get into this book and to study it, is the question of when the book was written. Now, for most books of the Bible, it's not, personally, I don't normally think it's that big a deal. The debate is, when was the Gospel of Luke written, or when was the Gospel of Matthew written, or when did Paul write this letter or that letter? Most of those debates aren't that important for the interpretation of the book. But this question for Revelation is actually really important. There are two main schools of thought as to when Revelation was written. Some people say that it was written what's called the early date. And this is usually in the 60s AD, somewhere between 64 to 68 AD, during the reign of Emperor Nero. And this would be several years before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The other school of thought is that it was written during the reign of Emperor Domitian, who reigned in the 90s AD. This is the late date. And so they think it was written during a period of persecution under that particular emperor, 3 decades later approximately than the first date. The reason the question of dating is important is because it affects the possible interpretations of the book. For example, one interpretation of the book of Revelation is that the majority of the events described in the book are referencing what happens in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. And that it's prophesying about those events. Well, guess what? If the book wasn't written until the 90s AD, it can't be a prophecy about those events because the events had already taken place. That doesn't make sense. But if it was written before 70 AD, I would argue not only does it make it possible, it actually makes it more likely that the book is talking about those events. And so that's just one of the things that we have to talk about before we get into it is when was this book written, because that affects how one approaches how to interpret the book. The majority of scholars today believe today, in our contemporary times, most of them would argue that it was written later in the 90s AD. However, that is not necessarily, that's a more recent turn of events. 100, 200 years ago, it seems that the majority of scholars argued for an early date. To explain why many scholars believe that it was written later, the majority of the argument rests on external testimony to the book. It rests on early church fathers writing about the book of Revelation and when they say it was written. And there's actually one particular father and one particular quote that is kind of the basis for this entire theory of when Revelation was written. It's this quote from the church father Irenaeus, and he says this: "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign." A couple things to note here. First, Irenaeus is actually saying, we don't know who the Antichrist is, and we're not going to speculate as to who that is. That's actually an interesting thing that he says that at this point, because this is very early on, and already you have debate and disagreement about how to interpret part of this book, and he's like, we'll just leave that alone. We're not gonna figure that out. But the particular question as to the dating of the book is he says that it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. So he's referencing John. John would have told us, for that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign. The question is, for the pronoun there, was it that, is Irenaeus saying that the vision was seen towards the end of Domitian's reign? Or is he saying that the apostle John was seen at the end of Domitian's reign? John is usually recognized as the oldest of the apostles, lived the longest, and lived into the 90s AD. And so there's debate. Was Irenaeus saying that the vision was seen in the 90s? Or was he saying that John was seen in the 90s, meaning that John was alive not too long ago and he could have told us who the Antichrist was if he wanted to reveal who that was? There's actually a debate as to what should be the proper translation of this passage. And so I would argue that it's a problem to use that text that's debated to base your entire theory of when Revelation was written. The other problem we have to consider is that Irenaeus was not always right on historical details. For example, he believed that Jesus ministered until he was almost 50 years old. And we know from the Gospels and other accounts that Jesus lived into his early 30s. He didn't live to be almost 50. And so Irenaeus got that historical detail wrong. If he is arguing that the vision was seen in the 90s, how accurate is this testimony of his to actually decide how to date the book of Revelation? So on the other side, I want to present why I believe that the book of Revelation itself more clearly fits with that earlier date of the 60s AD. There's three particular reasons why I think Revelation should better be understood as being written in the 60s. The first is this. In Revelation chapter 11, we have a particular vision that begins in this way. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple, leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So here you have John. This angel comes to him, tells him to go and to measure the temple and the altar, not to touch the outer court, though. And the question is this in any way a reference to the standing temple, or is this symbolic in some way? Now, I definitely believe there's a symbolic element to this, but we need to think in these terms. This makes a lot more sense if it's written in the 60s, with the temple still standing, as opposed to being written in the 90s, over 2 decades after the temple has been destroyed, where there is no more temple and there is no more altar, and still today there is no temple and there is no altar. This seems to be indicating an actual standing place because of the fact that the holy city is referred to as the city of Jerusalem. It's identified in the book of Revelation as the place where our Lord was crucified. And so it's very clearly referencing an historical, actual location. And so the fact that you have this reference to this temple and the altar as something to be measured, as something that's still standing, seems to indicate that that was still a historical reality at this point. Plus the fact that you have this reference to the court being given to the nations to trample for 42 months matches the time frame of the war against Israel by the Romans in the late 60s AD of the siege against Jerusalem, which lasts approximately 42 months. And so this section here, referencing what appears to be a still standing temple, and this reference to the outer court, the 42 months, all seems to fit very well with being written before the destruction of Jerusalem and the time frames of the events surrounding the temple of Jerusalem. The whole scene makes a lot less sense if the temple had already been destroyed at that point. The second evidence for an early date for Revelation is found in Revelation chapter 17. And this is particularly chapter 17, verse 10. Actually, let me back up to verse 9. Let me read Revelation 17, verses 9 and 10. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. So this is a vision of the beast, which has 7 heads, and here you're being given an interpretation as to what these things mean. Here we are told that the 7 heads refers to 2 things. It refers to 7 mountains, and it refers to 7 kings. The 7 mountains is a reference to the city of Rome. Rome was known as a city set on 7 hills. So the 7 mountains fits well with Rome as a historical city. But then we are also told that there are 7 kings, and we're told of these 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 has not yet come, and he will only remain a little while. This seems to very clearly indicate that when this vision was given, and when John was writing this down, there is a king who is reigning contemporary, like at the same time that he's doing this, and it's set within a historical context. There have been 5 previous kings, and then there's 1 that's going to come after who's only going to reign for a little while. Well, if you count the emperors of Rome, beginning with Julius Caesar, which you have various ancient historians that began the count of the Caesars with Julius. Technically, there's argument because it's like, well, was he really an emperor? Technically, the guy after him was the first official emperor, but almost everyone who looks at it is like, he was emperor, even if he didn't have the official title. Everyone essentially recognizes him as that. So if you begin with Julius Caesar, you have 5 kings who have passed away. The 6th, who currently is Nero, which would be during the 60s AD. And then the one that comes after him, who only reigns for a little while, would be Galba, who only reigns for 7 months. One of the shortest reigns of any of the Roman emperors at that point in time. And so we have to do something with this text, because it seems to be clear that there is a king who can be identified who is alive at the same time of the writing of Revelation. And if you don't start at the beginning, like even if you back it up even if you start with the emperor after Nero, and you start with Augustus, and you make Galba the 6th king, and the time when Galba becomes king, there's a reason he only reigns for 7 months, because there's a great time of civil war and unrest, and the guy after him doesn't reign very long either. And so, no matter where your starting point is, you still end up in the 60s AD. And to push it back later, to try to say that the 6th king is Domitian, it doesn't really fit. Like, where do you start with the beginning? You kind of end up in the middle of this list, but the list isn't anchored to anything. That makes sense? To say that there are 5 were and then 1 is, like, you have a beginning point, you have a present point, and then you have a prophecy about the future. It fits very well with the 60s. It doesn't fit that well with the 90s. And then the final thing I'll bring up is that there's the way Revelation speaks in chapter 2 and chapter 3 about the relationship between the church and the Jews seems to support an earlier date. I want to read 2 verses, one from chapter 2, verse 9, and one from chapter 3, verse 9. Chapter 2, verse 9, this is written specifically to the church at Smyrna. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And then chapter 3, verse 9, which is written to the church in Philadelphia. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. What you have going on here, we just did a study through the book of Acts in Sunday school, and we need to remember, early on in Christianity's history, there's a close relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Where does Paul always go first when he goes to a new town? He goes first to the synagogue, he goes to where the Jews are, and then he goes and he preaches to the Gentiles. And so there's a very close relationship between the two, and one of the big things that you have at this early point is, well, who are the true Jews? Are the true Jews those who keep all the laws of Moses, or are they those who have accepted the Messiah, Jesus Christ? Paul's always arguing we're the true Jews. He talks about this in Romans. Not all Israel is Israel. Just because you're ethnically an Israelite doesn't actually mean you spiritually are if you haven't accepted the Messiah. That's something that's a big deal in the early part of the first century as Christianity and the church are growing and starting to expand. After 70 AD, you don't have this issue as much anymore because Judaism kind of gets stomped on a little bit because the temple gets destroyed. It's gone. I mean, the center of their religious life and worship is completely wiped out. Their city is destroyed. And so after that, Christianity is seen as its own entity separate from Judaism at that point. That question of who are the true Jews is not saying the question completely goes away, but it's not as central to the life of the church at that point because God has vindicated himself against the Jews for rejecting him. And so the fact that Revelation twice in these particular letters to these churches speaks in this way, within the context of persecution, about defending them, recognizing, defending them against those who are part of the synagogue of Satan. There's still that emphasis on the place and power of the synagogue at that point. Yet, because they rejected the Messiah, they're called the synagogue of Satan. And the fact that you have this question of those who call themselves Jews but are not, that seems to make sense from an early date, in the time when that was still a big question in the history of the church, while Jerusalem was still standing, while the temple was still standing. It doesn't make as much sense if that happened later on in the 90s AD, decades after the temple's been destroyed and Judaism has been stomped on. And so for those reasons, I tend to argue that Revelation was written in the 60s AD as opposed to the 90s AD. I want to turn here and start talking about the various perspectives and ways that people approach Revelation and interpret it. But let me just pause there. Are there any questions on anything we've talked about so far? Does that make sense?
The first commentary.
All right.
So
let's talk about, there are four main perspectives that people bring when they read the book of Revelation. Does anyone know what these perspectives are, by any chance? Any of the perspectives. Yes. Yeah. Those big kind of categories. Yeah.
Dispensationalism, preterist, partial preterist. I think
the Puritans did not want the
That's pretty good. Okay, so those premillennial is perspectives on how to interpret chapter 20 in particular, the question of the millennium. But there's kind of four main categories, and Stephen was hitting on these in terms of what Revelation is about. So the four main categories are futurist, historicist, idealist, and preterist. And then you kind of have, people also talk about eclectic views. Eclectic basically means that you're merging some of these things together. And realistically, everyone's eclectic. Like no one's purely most people are not purely any of these. But let me explain what these are. So the futurist perspective, that's probably the most common perspective that you're familiar with in Christianity. Dispensationalists are futurists. They're not necessarily the only futurists, but futurists read Revelation as mostly talking about future events. That's why they're called futurists. And specifically, they would argue Revelation is talking about events that will take place right before the return of Christ. And so Revelation at that point becomes kind of like a handbook of what the last days of history are going to look like. Normally, and for most of these, this is where you're talking about chapter 4 on. There's less debate, though there is some, about the early parts, because Revelation 1 is kind of the introductory chapter. And then chapters 2 and 3 are where you have these 7 letters to the 7 churches. Though you've got different of these perspectives. Sometimes we'll read the 7 letters as talking about kind of like a general history of the church, and they kind of look at these particular churches as like particular ages in history. I don't agree with that. I think these are written to particular churches and particular people and particular places. But futurists, most of what you would read in Revelation 4 through the end of the book, they say that's all future events. Not only was it future for John when he wrote it, but it's future for us even today. Like, unless you're living at that specific point in time, this is all still future for you. The next perspective is the historicist perspective. And the historicist perspective reads Revelation as describing the history of the church throughout the ages, basically from that time of the first coming of Christ until the very end of history. And so they would read the different events as describing different major events, such as the rise of Catholicism and the Pope. The Pope is often identified as the Antichrist. The rise of Islam, the Mohammedans, and those things. They read Revelation as talking about these different things that happen in history. One of the difficulties is that almost every historicist reads themselves as being towards the end of the book, right before the finish of everything. And what happens is history keeps going on, and so you got to keep realigning, what historical events match with the book of Revelation. But this was a popular perspective, especially during the Reformation and post-Reformation era. So a lot of the reformers, not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them and various of the Puritans, they would read Revelation from this historicist perspective. They often used it as a polemic against Roman Catholicism because they basically identified Catholicism with all the bad guys in Revelation, and the Pope as the Antichrist in particular. Ironically enough, the Roman Catholics would read Revelation the same way, except they would flip it and make the Protestants the bad guys. And so it's like, okay, I'm not quite sure if this really works. You're just trying to use the book to make make other theological arguments. This view is not as popular today. There are some people that still read Revelation this day, but it's much more rare than in the past. The third view is the idealist view. And so the idealist reads Revelation, and they read Revelation not as much as talking about historical events, whether in the future or whether in the past or throughout all of history. They don't focus on that. Not that they would necessarily say that there's no history or historical references to actual events in Revelation, but they don't focus on that as much. Instead, they read Revelation as mainly focusing on describing spiritual truths and realities. For example, the struggle between good and evil, the struggle between Satan against Christ and the church, and the victory of Christ, and all those things. The idealist perspective, in many ways, I think they get a lot of the big ideas and themes right and make good application to the modern church. But I think they're missing something, in that Revelation is talking about actual things. And so that brings me to the fourth view, the preterist view, which is my particular view and what I want to describe a little bit. And I need to make a clarification here. The word preterism means fulfilled. And there's two different versions of preterism. There's a good version and there's a bad version. The bad version is called full preterism. Or sometimes hyper-preterism. That perspective says everything's been fulfilled all the way through Revelation 22. Like, this is it. The final coming has happened. There's no physical resurrection. This is all there is. There's no future new heavens or new earth, anything like that. It's a very small group of people that believe this. They are heretics. They are wrong. We will address those things as they come up. But they are out there. They do exist, and they give preterism a bad name. And so just be aware of that. R.C. Sproul, for example, is a partial preterist. Well, was a partial preterist. He died. But that was his perspective. But he was not a full preterist. Keith Matheson, who teaches at Reformation Bible College, actually edited and contributed to a book critiquing full preterism. So just be aware that that's out there. The good preterism, which we call partial preterism, it argues that a lot of Revelation has been fulfilled, but not all of it. So in particular, chapters 21 and 22, those are still future events we look forward to. Part of chapter 20 as well, depending on how exactly you interpret the millennium, which we'll get to when we get to chapter 20. But the partial preterist views that much of Revelation, chapter 4 through 18:19, is talking about historical events which at the time of the writing, when John wrote the book, they were still future. They're prophecies. But that those events have taken place specifically. There's debates about some particular things, but most would argue that a lot of them took place at 70 AD. Some of them may take place a little bit later on, having to do with the Empire of Rome, but that's what they would argue. That's why the dating of the book is really important, because, again, if it was written late, partial preterism can't be true. If it's written early, partial preterism can be true, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So, for example, a couple of things we got to deal with are statements that Revelation makes regarding the time of the events. So, Revelation 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. And then verse 3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. And then the end of Revelation, chapter 22, verse 6.
And it is one of those things.
And he said to me, these words are trustworthy and true, and the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. So this contrasts with like the book of Daniel. For the book of Daniel, at the end, he's told, seal up these books, for the time is not yet near. You know, you're writing about stuff that's still to happen hundreds of years away. It's not fully ready to be understood yet. Revelation is the exact opposite. These things are soon going to take place. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything in Revelation takes place soon. But there are a significant portion of this book is about stuff that is happening soon. This is a book that is written to 7 churches in the first century. Real churches with real people, with real struggles. You go through the letters in chapters 2 and 3, and these are personal, specific letters written to each of these churches dealing with their specific situations. And so Revelation is written about stuff that's going to happen to them. That's why I think it makes sense that it's writing about events that were soon to take place. It makes sense being written in the 60s AD. And it makes sense that the majority of it, not all of it, but the majority of it is writing about events that happened in the 60s and 70 AD connected with the destruction of Jerusalem. And part of the theological significance of that is Revelation is describing, in fact, one commentator actually entitled his commentary, The Divorce of Israel. And that Revelation is writing from a redemptive perspective about how God is vindicating his people against the Jews for the rejection of the Messiah. Because who are the ones in the first century that are leading the charge against the church and persecuting the Christians? It's the Jews. In fact, it's the Jews that when Paul's going around in the book of Acts preaching, they're the ones that follow him around stirring up trouble, trying to get him kicked out of different cities. And yet God comes against the Israelites for that rejection of the Messiah, and he judges them in 70 AD. And the Revelation, assuming that this interpretation is correct, which you're allowed to disagree with me, that's okay. Assuming that this interpretation is correct, part of the significance of the book is that this is writing about that major event. It's the vindication of the church. Christ on the side of his people, vindicating them against all the oppression, all the idolatry, all those who've rejected God, rejected this Messiah, rejected his people, and have been oppressing them, persecuting them, and seeking their destruction. And of course, the message of Revelation for the oppressed church is Christ will vindicate you, Christ wins, he will bring you through this. And so that part of the application for us today as well is that even if many of these events are fulfilled, the reality is there are still similar things that are happening. Persecution will continue to exist through all ages of the church. And as we saw God judge his enemies in 70 AD, we have confidence today as the church that God will vindicate us, that he will preserve and carry his church through all ages, through any opposition, through any persecution, and will bring us safe to the other side till we reach the consummation, the new heavens and the new earth, where we will dwell with God in glory forever and ever. So, those are the 4 main perspectives on Revelation. So that's just something to keep in mind as we start to work through the book in more detail. My plan for this is that we'll try as much as possible to do a chapter a week. So next week, Lord willing, we'll address chapter 1. And but of course, obviously, there's going to be some weeks where just because of the nature of what's going on, it might take a little longer than that. That's okay. But feel free. There's a lot of hard stuff in here. So feel free. Bring your questions. Read ahead. Be thinking about stuff. I can't promise that I'm not going to have all the right answers. I'll do my best. I'll look up stuff if I'm able to. And but hopefully this will be a profitable study for us. So, yes, Trevor.
Is there any correlation?
When we go back to Europe, they were different pockets of theological expressions, and there were churches, movements that would have influences beyond themselves. And there seems like in Germany that you had
And the churches correspond to
classical mental framework of doing.
I mean, there is overlap and connection, but these 7 churches are particularly in Asia Minor, if I remember correctly. So the letters of the New Testament go beyond that, like because Corinth is in Greece, Rome is in Rome or Italy, but Ephesus, of course, there's a letter to the church in Ephesus here in Revelation, but you don't have a letter to the Roman church, and there's letters written to churches in here that you don't have other letters from Paul written to. For example, Smyrna, Pergamum, things like that. So I don't know if there's more specific to that question or if that answers that.
That we have to live between the head and the heart. And this flows out of another lecture, which I won't give through this practice.
their location or is it their practice?
That the head and heart really flows out of.
Okay. So it seems to be, I think there is an aspect where there is a symbolic significance to the fact that they write to 7 churches. It seems kind of grouped by locale. If I remember correctly, these all are in Asia Minor.
It's like a circuit.
Yes. Yeah. However, that doesn't mean that, because obviously there are more churches than these 7. And he very easily could have written more letters or included more letters in the book of Revelation than just to these 7. Now, he does write specifically to these 7, and I think these letters do relate to the immediate context of those 7 churches. But the principles and application apply way beyond just those 7 churches. They apply to us today as well. But I think there's a symbolic significance that he's writing to 7. The reason those 7 there seems to be a geographical connection, and perhaps also those become kind of a good what's the word I'm looking for? Representation that this then has application for the broader
It's like
whole.
a sample of
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
some of those things happening today.
Right. Exactly.
Different churches all
Yep.
over the world.
Yeah.
Maybe at the time when the letters were
Which is more important? Is it better to have the heart? Is it better to have the head?
Yeah. And I mean, he would have known these churches, and
And so what I argue for is
Yeah.
if you want to be a church that
kind of a-
really
I don't know if it's an argument for or against
having
them
these things
being
so
written
far
in the
apart,
90s.
you have these two
Were these 7
lines
churches
together.
still in existence in the 90s?
I believe they were. I believe all of them were, as far as I know. Now, most of these churches obviously are not present today. Most of those cities were destroyed between now and 2,000 years ago. But yeah, my understanding is they were all still around in the 90s.
I was just saying if they weren't, that would be more of a reason to believe it was written.
Right, exactly. Yeah, as far as I know, I don't know. I haven't seen anything that talks about any of them not being around by that point.
Can I ask one more question? Does the Reformed Church, probably more specifically the OPC, what perspective do they seem to fall on in terms of?
You have diversity. So yeah, you could ask, I'm trying to think of how many ministers we have in our presbytery, 20 ministers, and you'll probably get 10 different perspectives. Actually, I was reading one theologian from the 1600s on this, and he's like, the reason I don't understand Revelation. I studied it. I asked 5 people I trusted, and I got 4 different answers. So he's like, I don't know what to do with this. I mean, so this goes back to one of the things I said earlier about humility and charity. I'm presenting to you my particular perspective from my study of Revelation over the years, and but there are good Christians that disagree with me on this. And I am not going to be offended if you disagree with me on this. And my hope is as well is that as we do this study, even if we disagree on particulars of the text, my goal is still to draw out applications and principles that we can all agree on and that can still benefit us here today, even if we disagree on what a particular thing is. And so that's, hopefully it will be profitable for everyone, even if it's, some of it is an iron sharpening iron as we work through hard things. But yeah, so you've got people in the OPC that would agree with me on the dating and how to interpret it. You've got people in the OPC that would disagree with me on the date. Or they might agree on the date, but still hold a different perspective in how to approach and interpret it. There's a lot of diversity out there. And one of the, I don't know if it's encouraging or not, but I think it's encouraging, is even in the early church, most of the big perspectives that we have today, you find in the early church. Not all exactly the same, but broad strokes, you'll have similarity. And that just tells me that this is something Christians have struggled with for a long time. And that's okay. That we can struggle and disagree with these things. We do our best. We try to be faithful. Let me put it this way. It is good to read the book of Revelation. And I think we can reach a certain level of understanding with the book of Revelation, even if we're a little muddy on some of the details. And I want to emphasize, verse 3, there's a number of places where Revelation talks about blessings. And one of them is this, verse 3, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it, and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near." And so I think that's something that extends for all the church, that there is blessing attached to those who read and hear this book and do their best to be faithful to follow God and apply the books to their lives. I know several churches in our presbytery that it's either the last Sunday of the year, the first Sunday of the year in their evening service, they don't have a normal service. They do a book of Revelation reading, where they'll have a call to worship, they'll have like an opening song, and then they read the entire book of Revelation in one go. They might rotate through a couple of people because that's a lot of reading. But part of it is there's particular blessing added to the reading of this book. And this book reminds us and orients us that Christ wins and Christ is in control. And what we are moving towards is the new heavens and new earth. And it's appropriate, or it can be appropriate at the beginning of the year to kind of orient ourselves that, hey, this is where we're going. We're thinking about New Year's resolutions, all those things. We're moving towards heaven. That's what Revelation helps direct us towards. So, sorry, I kind of rambled there on your question. Yeah, Trevor.
I think the book of Revelation summarizes
knowledge,
of Scripture, all the fulfillment of Scripture.
It does a lot of that. I mean, so one author writing on the book of Revelation calls it the climax of prophecy. And because this is tying everything together. I mean, in chapter 21 and 22 are tying in themes from Genesis of the tree of life, and all that symbolism from Eden is now being tied together and fulfilled in Revelation. And I mentioned this before, I didn't mention it tonight, but depending on who you ask, there's different counts, but Revelation is full of hundreds of allusions to the Old Testament. There's themes and imagery that he's drawing on from the Old Testament and connecting all of these threads together. And so
remember when we did the book of Ezekiel?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What was happening
Mm-hmm.
in the temple.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, even in Revelation 19.
Yep.
Where marriage, verse 9.
Yep.
As the rebels were called to the marriage supper of the Lamb.
Yeah, there's parallel. When we did our eschatology class, we talked about some of those parallels to Ezekiel and Revelation 19, and the temple too. The temple in the end of Revelation corresponds to the temple in Ezekiel 40 and 48.
It's the fulfillment of
Yep.
hope. It's the blessed hope.
Yep.
It's not a hope that maybe it will happen.
Right.
It's a sure
It's a
hope.
certain, yes. It's a certain hope. Yeah. All right. Any other questions, thoughts before we close this evening?
What do you think of this is?
There'll be a few weeks before we get into the really fun stuff. Right? The first three chapters are kind of easing into this, right? Chapter 1 though has one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite sections where it has the first presents the vision of Jesus, which is just fantastic. I love that. And then you have the 7 letters. But chapter 4 is where you really start to get into the fun stuff. Yes, the throne room of God. Yes, Steve.
And I think that's the key to Revelation. Of course, where you sit historically, because John is on Patmos, so the argument would be made that Domitian put him there because Domitian was known for putting his own family on Patmos, a penal colony at the time. But John, who's been persecuted, and I don't know if this was before or after, I think Domitian's the one who boiled him, and he survived. But being the last surviving apostle, he sees Jesus in this glorified state. And I think when I went through Revelation, it was the supremacy of Jesus Christ, because you see Christ in the throne and everything centers around him.
Mm-hmm.
And that just makes this, I think that's like the key to the book, is seeing the supremacy of Christ over all things.
Yep. Yep. That's good.
Because even though, I understand, even though Jesus is presented in the chapter 1, you know, he's also relevant, like after the end. You know, you will see him in his glory, even after all the things that have happened.
Yep.
He triumphs, so he is presented in chapter 1, but he's also presented after chapter 22.
Yep.
Chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
So chapter 1 could be chapter 23.
One common factor was George.
Anything else?